Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 65th episode of the Manor Podcast. I'm your co-host, Roger Bodee, joined as always with my best friend and other co-host, Michael Hamilton. Michael, did you know that law school is going to be a lot of work?
I have heard that.
Yeah, I just finished orientation last week, and in undergrad or things like that, you'll have like your introductory classes and your professors will hand out your syllabus in the class or whatever. Not in law school. I already have like dozens of cases I need to brief and go through and be prepared to present and be called upon in class on day one of class. So, yay, law school!
Huh? That does sound like a lot. Are you excited at least?
Excited, nervous, terrified. It's a whole range of emotions.
This
Sad
sounds like
that I
me
don't get to
before
play
a
as
tournament.
much Flesh and Blood.
Excited, nervous, terrified.
Yeah. Because the whole Wolfpack's testing our sweet deck that we're going to win nationals with, and I'm just watching here and there, and I just haven't made a lot of time to just sit down and play a lot of matches of Flesh and Blood. It's tragic.
Yeah, I don't know. I hope someone on the team wins nationals. I do think the deck we're working on is pretty cool. I'm excited to play it, but yeah.
So there seems to be fear and anxiety on the team deck now. I think people are jumping ship. People are like, oh no, I can't play this deck. I need to play another deck. And I'm like, no, you fools. Our deck is so good. But I can't show you the way. I'm too busy in law school now. It's just a travesty.
I think. So one thing that I've noticed with internal testing in the Wolfpack is it is very hard to have a very good win rate because you're testing against a lot of other very good players. So it's very hard to be very confident because you're like not winning a lot of the time because everyone's very good.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
It does make it tough.
That and it's really hard, especially on our team of our size, to like not get like too, I guess, like self-contained, too echo chambery, because if we start with a build of a deck and then somebody reacts to our build of the deck and they start beating our build of the deck, but it's not necessarily tech that other people are on, then like we can start over preparing and putting cards on our sideboard that aren't really warranted. And I think a little of that has been going on, which is why this week I want to talk about sideboarding.
Woo, good transition.
Yeah. So first and foremost, let's start with like, what are your just high level approaches to like building a sideboard in your decks that you build?
So I think the biggest thing is high level is I want to make sure that I have 60 cards that I can play into all the popular meta heroes that I am not embarrassed to put in my deck. And I also want to make sure I can present 5 pieces of equipment into every hero in the game that I'm not embarrassed to have in my deck. I guess 6 for some heroes, usually 5, sometimes 6. Got some one-handed weapons, some offhands going on, but for the most part, 5.
Okay. All right, that makes sense to me, because equipment, if we want to start there as well, is going to be like the most foundational piece to most people's sideboarding, right? The go-to starting point is just like, well, just throw a couple pieces of Arcane Barrier, in your sideboard for the Wizards or something like that. Just like, oh, look at that. I fixed my Kano matchup. I have AB3. Can't ever lose to Kano now. And I think looking back all the way back to when Icelander started becoming prominent, I think a lot of people carried over that expectation that, oh, Wizard need more Arcane Barrier before they realized the play pattern of like, oh, AB1 versus an Aether Icebane and then pay 2 from cards in hand is really strong. And then a lot of decks started adapting to just AB1. Do you remember that like time and like kind of that evolution in sideboarding happening?
Yeah, I think that happened around like everyone was playing AB3 when I went to nationals last year. That's actually part of what led me to like Scar for Scar, Wounded Bowl. Like the 0-for-3 arcane spells, like Encased and Icebind, were quite bad into opponents playing AB3. And because of that, it just seemed like it made more sense to just jam some physical attacks in. If they're going to play AB3 anyway, their armor's not blocking very well.
Yeah, true. And especially with decks like Oldheim floating around and Crown of Seeds at that time. So like there's just a lot of ways to prevent the arcane damage that people were kind of expecting from that deck. And so pivoting away from that into a bull lander presenting more physical damage was obviously a really good call and won you a lot of tournaments.
It
But I guess like, do you think people underutilize like different equipment slots for different matchups? I guess like one thing that I commonly see is in longer matchups, people say, well, I know this game's going to go long, so like 10 plus turns. So I'm going to get Findel Spring Tunic in for this matchup. And if I know this is going to be a short game, I'm going to play something like
Heart and Cross
Aether
Strap
Iron Weave or Heart and Cross Strap
Sure.
or cards like that. Do you think not enough players or sideboards consider like the length of the game when factoring in like the value they're going to get out of their equipment?
It's hard to say whether not enough do or the right amount do. I do think it is good and correct to do that. I think in like Ninja Mirrors, for example, you usually want Heart and Cross Strap over Tunic, or at least as Katsu, because like the turn you draw that Surging Strike, you need to go, and if you don't have a blue or you have to block with your blue, you really like the Heart and Cross Strap gives a lot of value to that hand. And in a game that's going 15 turns, yeah, Tunic gives up enough or gives you enough value that it makes up for losing the Heart and Cross Strap. But in a game that's likely to go 5 or 6 turns, you just really want the 2 resources on your big turn. And I don't know if there's a lot of other great examples of that where it's like equipment that is very good in a short game versus equipment that's very good in a long game.
The other example that sticks out in my head is last meta when Zach was testing Viscerai and Alexi. He actually started siding out Grasp, even though it's like a very good card and you can get a lot of value out of it in a long game by continually making the rune chance. He started playing Vexing Quillhand instead because when he wanted that reduction or he wanted to give Swarming Loomveil go again in that +1, he just had it at a moment's notice, and he was giving up like the extreme amount of value. Grasp of the Arcanite's like one of the best equipment in the game just because he just needed that ability to go when you needed to go. So I thought that was quite an interesting pivot as well at the time.
Yeah, it seemed kind of like his plan was, I need to kill Lexi in 4 turns or something. And if you're trying to kill her in 4 turns, it doesn't matter what it does, like, you have to just take the damage and kill her if that's what your plan is. And I think it worked out really well for him. He did beat a lot of Lexis doing that. So
for sure. And then I guess the other advantage to maybe going a little bit heavier on equipment versus cards and deck is when you are bringing in sideboard equipment, you're going to have access to that resource whenever you want it in the game, because your equipment obviously start and stay on the battlefield and you're going to be able to use it whenever the time comes up. But if you put in like something that's like a very specific tech card in your deck, you're kind of at the mercy of it lining up well in a specific time interaction where it falls in your deck if you're only playing one copy. Infamously, we saw in the finals of you versus the Fatigue Oldheim, he had the one tech card of the sideboard of the Imperial Ledger, and it just was in the last like 10, 15 cards of his deck. Imperial Warhorn, not Ledger. 2 very different cards. But still, like, I guess that's kind of like the danger of putting in like cute one of tech cards in your sideboard sometimes, right?
yeah, I think also on top of that, so equipment, if it's in play, you're always going to get full value out of it. Going from like a bad equipment that's bad in the matchup to an equipment that's good in the matchup, it's probably worth like 2, 3, maybe even 4 or 5 points of value over the course of the matchup. Like every game, you're always going to get that, assuming that the equipment is a reasonable upgrade from what you would play otherwise in that specific matchup. Then you're always getting those points. And then like for cards in your deck, because of how modal cards are in Flesh and Blood, where you can block with them, you can pitch them, you can play them. Every card has 3 modes, I guess, except like Gorganian Tome or cards that don't block, where they only have a few modes or two of those options available. Or wait, I guess Gorganian Tome only has 1. But anyway, you can't pitch it or block with it. But most cards, you can do something with. So if you have a blue that's pretty bad in the matchup, maybe you'll find a window where you can pitch it for 3 points of value. And that means like upgrading the blue that's bad in the matchup to a blue that's good in the matchup. Probably only going to net difference 1 point, maybe 0 if you end up just pitching the other blue anyway. So using sideboard slots on cards in deck, because every card does multiple things, and even the cards that are weaker in the matchup you can use for a different purpose. It means it's just like not that efficient to replace cards with other cards in most matchups. Like, yes, it is good, and you obviously don't want a sideboard of 20 equipment because there just aren't 20 equipment that you would feasibly want in pretty much any deck. But spending the slots on the equipment first is usually worth a lot of value.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think after equipment, what I think you have some favorite cards you like to just kind of auto slot in a lot of the time in your sideboards, right? Maybe some generic 4 blocks.
I wouldn't say auto slot in, but you have to have a pretty strong reason to not want Sink Below. It's just such a good card that's so good in a lot of spots. We both put it as number 1 in the game when we did top 10 card list forever ago. And I think like not every deck wants 3 copies of Sink Below, but it is not a bad idea to start testing with 3 copies of Sink Below for matchups that have a lot of breakpoints and on hits and you need to be defensive in.
Yeah. Do you think there's more merit, or do you think too many decks sideboard cards like Oasis Respite then over Sink Below, or do you think Oasis Respite is still like underutilized in sideboards at the moment because it still has all the utility into decks like Bravo and decks that are presenting those big, or Azalea, but there's other cards that are preventing Azalea from being good at the moment. But it also has so much equity into the Wizards and a little bit into the Room Blades as well. I don't know, but you've traditionally been pretty against Oasis Respite though.
Yeah, it's a card I didn't realize how bad it was until I started learning Icelander. And I'm like, Icelander's so good at using resources at different times. And she just can frequently use resources. And then you draw Oasis Respite, you don't have a good way to use it. And it's like, oh. And pitching a red to cast Oasis Respite, that's a 2-card 4, maybe a 2-card 5. That's not something I ever want to be using a deck slot on. Like, yes, sometimes you're going to 2-card 4 or 2-card 5 by using your cards inefficiently because that's how things line up. But I'm not putting a card in my deck where that's like it's reasonably expected to happen.
Sure. Makes sense.
So I think Oasis is quite bad. I think if you want sideboard slots for Kano, you probably should just find room for Spell Void. There's a lot of good Spell Void options. And if you don't have good Spell Void options available, you can always play Spell Void 1, the Spell Fray equipment. And I think that is better for your win rate than slotting in Oasis.
Yeah.
In general.
Particular, like Oasis, I think the most tech that people want it for is to covering up or helping prevent damage from the Aether Wildfires from Kano, because obviously when you prevent damage there off Aether Wildfire, it carries over to preventing damage on all the future spells for the rest of the turn that Kano's trying to kill you with when he's going off. But particular for Icelander, since she already has so much disruption and natural arcane barrier, it makes it so that she doesn't need cards like Oasis Respite to cover up that otherwise difficult to interact with damage that a lot of decks might otherwise struggle with. So if like you're a deck that doesn't have really good options for Arcane Barrier, I think that might lead you to maybe be slightly more interested in Oasis Respite, but I still think it's a tough sell given that it costs that 1 resource.
Yeah, I guess that was the biggest thing. At some point in testing Icelander versus Kano, I realized that if the Oasis was just another blue, my hands would be so much more flexible and I'd be preventing basically the same amount of damage, because if you have 2 cards in hand and they wildfire you, you can cast an Oasis in AB2 to cover up 6 damage. If you just have 2 blues in AB5, you can pitch 2 blues to AB5, and the 2 blues are way more flexible. And yeah, so I think Oasis is not great.
Fair enough.
I do think there is also some relevance with covering up dominate effects, because for defense reactions, they have to be in your arsenal to cover up dominate with a defense reaction plus another card. And that is kind of a selling point of playing Oasis, is if you have a hand of a 3 block plus Oasis, then you can block for 7 with 3 cards, and 3 card blocking for 7 is not good, but sometimes like if Azalea is dominating something that you need to cover up, then it can be nice there. But I just ultimately don't find it to be good enough to warrant sideboarding it.
Yeah. I think the Guardians are I think the best homes for Oasis. Obviously, Oldheim didn't need it a lot of the time, but I think Bravo now, especially if you're playing effects like Rampart of the Ram's Head or Staunch Response already, you can have the ability to have that one floating resource a lot. And especially I especially was happy with Oasis into the Rune Blades while I was heavily testing Bravo, because they're just kind of preventing this random chip arcane damage with like Rune Chance or Bramble Spark or things like that. And then you'll often have that one floating resource at the end, and you can just use Oasis Respite to cleanly cover up what's one card that cleans up an entire Rosetta Thorn swing. So I think that's kind of a useful application for it, but I think you have to kind of be planning to be very defensive against the Rune Blades and want to play a very long game where you're trying to mitigate as much damage as possible. So that's kind of a pretty niche way to handle that matchup, I would say.
Yeah, I think Fatigue Oldheim was actually probably the best deck for Oasis, where you know that when you pitch a blue, you can activate Crown of Siege, you can activate Rampart of the Ram's Head, and then you can cast this Oasis. And that's spending 2 cards for 6 points of value, which is still just like at rate with 2/3 blocks, but it's more flexible in how you use it. You're getting your Crown of Siege filter, and if you're below on life, you get that 1 extra point from the Oasis. I usually prefer Sink Belows and Fate for Scenes because you can 2-card 7 pretty easily with those without having to be below life. It's just a little worse for hitting breakpoints, maybe if the 3 block is worse than a Crown and a Shield for covering up damage. And then sometimes if you're playing Fatigue Oldheim, you might already be maxed on Sink Belows and Fate for Scenes and want more of these effects. And that's where Oasis kind of shines.
For sure. And then I think there was a card that was popping up a lot last time that Icelander was popular. And now that Icelander is popular again, I haven't seen it pop up as much again. And that's Energy Potion. I know we were kind of advocates that like it's not the best use of sideboard slots and maybe was starting to be over included. But do you think it might be time for Energy Potion to maybe start creeping back into some lists here and there?
Yeah, I do think Energy Potion is pretty good. There are hands where you want to just play a 1-card hand, or like maybe you do a go again attack, and then like in the aggro deck specifically where you're threatening that snatch on hit, Icelander is kind of incentivized to hold cards back to cover up the snatch if you snatch, and then you play an Energy Potion, and suddenly Icelander is like, shoot, how do I use my 4 cards? I'm not very good at spending 4 cards. And that combined with like having the Energy Potion for either stopping an Aether Ice Vein on hit, paying for the Aether Ice Vein on hit, yeah, or playing it in response to cracking it in response to a channel or a Frostbite to get 2 resources to make sure you can still play your power turn when you draw your power turn. I think the card is relatively effective against Icelander, and you also just usually want more blues against Icelander because of how her deck functions. So yeah, Energy Potion is definitely a solid choice there. We even saw it, I think Craig Pollock was using it in the AGE Open in his Guardian deck as part of his fatigue plan against Icelander, where he'd set up these Energy Potions, and now if you Frost X combo well, he just has 6 resources on demand to crack the 3 Energy Potions, make 6 resources, use Crown of Seeds to clear all the Frostbites, and bam, didn't take any damage from the Frost X combo. So that's like more of a niche use, but it's definitely Energy Potions are pretty good against Icelander.
Yeah, and even when you're an aggressive deck or like a more mid-rangey deck, and your deck's kind of built around really powerful one-off turns, specifically, I remember playing them in Bolton pretty happily, where without them, if you played a Blizzard when I was trying to do like a View the Vanguard or one of my powerful turns, I was just blown out dead, like just can't win. But if I have an Energy Potion sitting there, it really checks like those, not only Channeling Frigid, but also like those Blizzard effects that could otherwise just end a turn on the spot. You can just crack an Energy Potion and be like, okay, here's your 2 resources, and I can still pay through 1 Frostbite just fine.
Yeah. One thing to be careful about with Energy Potion, though, is if the channel is already in play, it costs 1 to sacrifice the Energy Potion, so it's only netting 1 resource at that point.
For sure.
Still a good card.
Yeah. And then I guess last classic sideboard thing, everybody always talks about it, everybody thinks about it, everybody says it. Poppers. We gotta make sure we have those 6+ powered attacks to make sure that we can blow up those dragons and I guess maybe heralds if somehow that happens.
Maybe someday. Yeah, poppers are interesting. There are a decent amount of 6 powered attacks that have use in other matchups. Like a lot of decks that need disruption can sideboard and command and conquer against decks that are either A, vulnerable to command and conquer, like Rangers, or B, just are very combo based and you just need that extra disruption. And then it also doubles down as a popper. So I think command and conquer is kind of like pretty common. But yeah, poppers are very good. I think Dromai has been tier 1 or up there for quite a while, and making sure that you have some poppers to not just get overwhelmed by dragons is very important.
I guess, like, what do you think is like the right amount of poppers for a deck that, like, so Lexi traditionally they can play something like what's that 6 power arrow? It starts with a B, right? Battering bolt. I was like, it's not bolt and shot. That's the good one. Battering bolt. Do you think playing that card can wind up costing you more than not including it? Like, I think sometimes decks are like, oh, I got to have poppers, and they can wind up going overboard with it where their deck is then like clunkier overall. And then especially against a deck like Redline Dromai, where that's not even trying to play like a super long game, just trying to get a lot of value with like 0 for 4s and like just use the dragons as value when they pop up. Do you think people kind of like overvalue poppers into Dromai a little bit?
So it's kind of weird. I think that I'm going to take us back to the past and talk about old Prism a little bit. So against old Prism, it was very common to want to sideboard in your poppers and bring in your command and conquers, but then sometimes they would just aura you and they would just kill you with auras, and auras never turn on your poppers. Maybe they never even attack with something that gets popped, or they attack with what's the 1 for 7 called
Phantasmal
that makes an aura? It's not fractal replication. It's the other one.
Oh, I know it. It's so good. How can we forget this one?
It's been too long. Prism's been dead for too long. But anyway, they attack with their auras. They build up this aura game plan, and you have these clunky 2 or 3 costs, 6 or 7 power attacks. Yeah, they attack with no poppable cards or just miraging metamorph, and you're looking at these cards and you're like, dang, these cards suck. And then you have to just like spend 2 cards to send your popper at their aura and just slowly lose the game like that. So against Prism, I think it was very common that people would make the mistake of sideboarding in too many poppers. Even if you only have like 1 or 2, then it's always going to be on Prism's mind, especially if it's a closed deck list tournament where you could just like you could honestly play 0 poppers some of the time and they'd still like have to respect poppers, because if they do get popped, then they're just going to lose. So I think usually the answer was more than 1, but I think people went overboard and sideboarded in too many poppers against a deck that ultimately wasn't really trying to play that game plan of just attacking with heralds. They really wanted to be doing the aura thing, and the aura thing was kind of stronger than this really vulnerable plan. But against Dromai, it's kind of different, because Dromai, while she can play around poppers by sending, like you said, the red light version of Dromai where they have a lot of attacks, that deck still has like 20 to 30 dragons, and all the dragons run into poppers.
Not Mirror Guy. He's pretty safe into a popper.
Sure. Mirror Guy doesn't run into poppers. All the other dragons run into poppers. Chromai kind of gives you a little bit of insurance where, like, if you have a big board, you can Chromai attack and then attack with the dragons afterwards, even if Chromai gets popped. But poppers are still really important against Dromai because they kind of end their turn. There's a lot of value. And when you pop a dragon, let's say you pop, for example, an Asvalai, you're saving 2 life by blocking the Asvalai, and then you're also saving yourself from having to deal 3 damage to it. So that's like a 1 card 5-point swing, just popping an Asvalai. And the bigger dragons are even more impactful. Popping a Kyloria or a Yenderai is usually worth much more than the 5 points of value you're getting from popping an Asvalai. And that's not even counting that you're ending their turn. So any other dragons they wanted to attack with now can't attack either. So it's usually a pretty big swing when you pop a dragon against Dromai. And Dromai can't really play in a way where she never runs into poppers. Even if she knows your deck's full of poppers, like let's say Dromai versus the Guardians, usually the plan involves attacking a lot of dragons into poppers throughout the course of the game. Usually we've seen Ghostly Touch end up with like 15 counters on it before, because that means she got popped 15 times. So even in the matchups that Dromai is like, yes, you're always gonna have a popper, I know this, she still ultimately has to send dragons into poppers, and that's part of her game plan. So poppers are definitely better against Dromai than they were against Prism, and you do want some poppers, but if you do have too much and your deck is too clunky, Dromai can also just kind of build up a board or find another way to beat you, or build up a board and then play a Lost in Thought and then attack with all of her dragons. And if she's just building up dragons and not attacking you with them, which is very common against Guardians, especially where you just build up dragons and they're not very good at clearing the dragons because they usually get to do one big thing every turn, then that can lead to some awkward spots where basically if you're drawing a bunch of poppers and Dromai's not attacking with the dragons, now your deck doesn't run as smoothly as it would if you didn't have these poppers. If you draw a hand of 2 red poppers and 2 red other cards that are good in your deck, and Dromai just goes like Blaze Headlong, like Scar for a Scar, Rabble, then make 2 dragons, and then passes. Now your hand kind of sucks. And that can happen a lot. And then the other side of that is, you talked about Lexi specifically. If you're playing Lexi into Dromai, if you're not playing against the more aggressive version of Dromai, they might just be trying to block for the most part until they can find a Tomotai, block and play Tomotai. And then if they're able to, if that's kind of the plan they're on, then the poppers aren't really going to help get through that, because the poppers, you can attack with them, but they're usually less efficient than your arrows with pretty meaningful on hits, and weaker than your natural go again arrows like Falcon Wing and Bolt and Shot. So you can still attack with them, but if the Dromai is reasonably defensive, then they might just be blocking until they find Tomotai. And if they are able to cast a Tomotai and blow up your New Horizons, all the poppers in the world aren't going to save you. You're in a lot of trouble without New Horizons in that matchup.
That's fair. And then I guess while we're talking about poppers, then there are kind of cards people sometimes play that they just will try to gain a lot of equity into very specific matchups. They're very specific. They're very targeted sideboard cards if they're a matchup that they really struggle into. Like Lexi can play Codex of Inertia if they're really worried about like their Icelander matchup, for example, and they really want to gain a lot of equity there. Taking Icelander off of Arsenal is like really important. We saw things like, classic Prism. People will play things like Lead the Charge in their decks in order to make sure that they could get multiple action points to clear auras. What do you think about like very specific tech cards in sideboard?
Yeah, when a hero is very clear they're going to be a big part of the metagame, or if it's a matchup that is shifted a lot by including this one card, for example, like the Fatigue Oldheims playing Warhorn versus not playing Warhorn, that's one slot that gives you a lot more equity into Icelander than you'd have without it. I think spending the slot to significantly shift a matchup, or shift a matchup that's going to be pretty common by a few percentage points, is definitely worthwhile, especially if you're not looking for sideboard slots elsewhere. I think the most common example of this right now in the metagame is Down and Dirty. It's basically only there for Dromai. It's a popper that you can put in your arsenal and then pop from your arsenal, which is very good against Dromai. And I think that's the card that's like very specifically for one matchup, though I guess you probably would also play it into Prism. I think it's warranted by the fact that Dromai is one of the more common and stronger decks in the metagame. So playing a specific hate card that gives you a decent amount of percentage points in the matchup makes sense. Similarly, when Prism was running rampant forever ago, I think playing some copies of Lead the Charge was very worthwhile, because you'd expect to play against Prism a decent amount, and playing some copies of that card could significantly shift the matchup in your favor or make it a lot better than it was.
Yeah. So I generally tend to stay away from these types of cards. I think it takes a lot to convince me to play something like a Down and Dirty, or a card that I know I'm only going to bring into one specific matchup. And the reason I am so hesitant to do that is because, let's say Down and Dirty gives you like an extra 5% equity into this one specific matchup. Like it takes your win rate from like 55 to 60%. Whereas you can use that slot that gives you an extra 2% equity in like 3 matchups. So then you're increasing your win rate by 6% overall by pivoting away from that one card for a specific matchup and then having a higher win rate and more across the board. And that's what I think of whenever I'm putting a card in my sideboard. I really want to think like, okay, I go through and I look at like the matchups. What's my sideboard plan? What matchups am I using this card in? Can I use it for another matchup? Is there some hidden equity or some nice thing about this card that I could apply from like, I guess maybe even like down and dirty, maybe you could use it as like this bad defense reaction against Bravo if you were something interested in something like that, even like hypothetically. And I guess like whenever somebody is like, I want to put in this one thing that does one very specific thing, especially at a very specific like timing interval. So that was also why you never saw me, even in my builds of Oldhim, like I don't think I would ever put like Imperial Warhorn in my Oldhim deck, because I also alluded to this at the beginning. When you put in specific tech cards, you also are counting on them lining up at the right time. And Down and Dirty solves a lot of that against Dromai, where, you know, if they're presenting a bunch of 0 for 4s and you draw like a 3 popper hand, you just draw like 3 Command and Conquers in the same hand. Like you just can't do anything with that hand. And that's what I was saying that could get kind of clunky. And I think more decks would be better by finding more proactive strategies into matchups as opposed to reactive strategies. And I think that just leads to better deck building design overall. And I think that's kind of what the nice thing about Energy Potion is as well, is that it is not, it sits on the battlefield. So if you want to use it reactive for like playing for an Aether Ice Vein or Blizzard or something like that, it fills that role. But if you want to do it for something proactive, like against Bullander, when I was playing Energy Potion as Bolton, sometimes I would crack it and just play a Soul Shield, just because you just need that card and you can only have so many cards you can cut. But the fact that it just gave you those 2 resources and you can play a card off of it, you can crack it and play a V the Vanguard. You can crack it if you want to do like a more combo oriented thing and then not have to worry about pitching things. Like it fills a lot of different roles, even though, you know, it's primarily there for this one matchup, this one interaction. The fact that it can have more utility and do other things is like something I really value when I'm thinking about cards in my deck.
Yeah, I agree with that a lot. I think going back to your first point about being 5% against Dromai or 2% increase against 3 other matchups, you also kind of have to weigh that by how much you expect the field to be. If the field's going to be like 50% Dromai, then like you should take the 5% in a Dromai card, because it's just showing up.
The math's a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, but yeah, I think that is a good way to look at it. If you can get a decent chunk against one deck, or you can get a smaller chunk against several decks, it's probably a lot of the time it is better to take the smaller increase against several decks. But you also have to be careful, because you don't want cards. You want to be careful about over sideboarding. If you have a bunch of cards that help a little bit against a lot of different matchups, if you're boarding all these different cards in that help a little bit against all these other matchups, you actually might be making your deck worse, because you're taking away from like the linear game plan of it and making it just less consistent overall with all these weird cards that are supposed to increase the matchup. But when you draw too many of them, maybe they're just like actively detrimental together.
Yeah, but I think that comes down to then understanding the tenets of your main deck at that point then as well. And whenever I'm building a deck, I don't build a 60 card main deck, or at least I don't consider like the main chunk of cards to be like 60 cards at any given point in time. I want to build somewhere between 45 to 55 cards that offer me like one really powerful cohesive strategy. And then from there, maybe I can trim a card or 2 out of that really powerful cohesive strategy if I really want some like really heavy swing sideboard cards. But then I just add value to the matchup through the additional sideboard cards while I'm still maintaining like the really powerful core. I'm never considering like against like if I'm a Rune Blade or something like that, like I never want to be taking out cards that would enable me to play that attack and non-attack action in a turn, just to bring in like a lot more powerful non-attack actions in a matchup. Like you want to make sure that you're maintaining that ratio when you're a Rune Blade or something like that. It's just really making sure that you understand the core tenets of your deck when you're sideboarding as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think that is a very common thing that people do, where they like this is my 60 card main deck and these are my sideboard cards, and then when I'm bringing cards in, I need to swap cards out. But I think that's not I think it's a much better way to look at it, being like, okay, these are the 20 to 30 cards I'm playing every time. These are the 10 to 20 cards I'm playing most of the time. And these are the other 20 cards that I'm swapping in and out a lot. And I think that's usually how I look at my decks. And even then, I don't really like acknowledge the difference between the cards I'm never cutting and the cards I'm not cutting that often. It's just like when you play with the cards, you find that out. So like when I was playing Bolander a lot, I lumped all the attacks in like the never cut category. And then I realized that's not true. I actually cut scars against the other wizards because you're ahead so often and you don't want
Wounded Bull against Briar because she's good at blocking.
Yeah, I think I don't remember if I was cutting it or trimming it at the end, but I was definitely not playing 3 copies into Briar at the end or at like Worlds.
Yeah, that was the biggest one I remember.
Mm-hmm. So, and these were cards that I like was like, no, I'm never cutting these cards. They're so good. And then like, I'm like, actually in this one situation, I do want to cut this card. So
exactly.
And if you look at your deck as like 45 to 50 card main board, then like you might miss those spots where you should cut that one card that's part of your main deck in the matchup that actually it's like better to cut that card than one of your other cards.
Yeah. And then I think there's a component to Flesh and Blood that is kind of lacking at the moment. And it's a shame because I think it's one of the more interesting things about the game. And that's the fact that, you're sideboarding before you play a game. So you have to be dialed into the meta usually to understand what the most popular decks of a particular hero are doing, what their builds are like, why you're boarding and the cards you're wanting to do, because you expect the matchup to play a certain way in advance. You're making your sideboarding decisions like way in advance. And that's why, you and I had so much equity over that Bolander weekend a year ago now, because people were expecting Icelander to play one way. And then we were just going like, yeah, but we're going to play this way. And I just think like it's a shame that there's not more decks that have that kind of like dichotomy between their build. There's usually in the meta like a stock way to build a deck, and then that's just kind of like it's just people determine like, well, this is just the most optimal way to be doing this, so I'm going to be doing that. And there was a lot of good opportunity there for especially the Tales of Aria heroes because they were both lightning and ice, lightning and earth and ice. So like there should have been like multiple different ways for these decks to present themselves, and we saw that a little bit with lightning Lexi versus like ice Lexi. I think that's kind of like the most prominent one, but still at the end of the day, I think most heroes just kind of homogenize, and it would be a lot more interesting in Flesh and Blood. I think if there were just like, even if there were just different like ways for your deck to like sideboard into like the same matchup differently. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do really like when heroes have like multiple approaches that they can take 2 matchups and like you have to like, or like you can like kind of catch your opponent off guard. I know at PT1 that after Starvo got Autumn's Touch banned, we were like, well, I was like kind of like, well, defensive Starvo's dead, Autumn's Touch is gone. You can't really do it anymore. But defensive Starvo is still a real deck that you could bring and it kind of catch people off guard by playing the more defensive version of the deck. Oldheim kind of also had that. It's not like whether he's ice or earth. It was whether he was going to try to fatigue you by threatening disruptive on hits, or if he was just going to like full block fatigue and just like not really have much pressure at all, just play defensively and say, you have to beat this. And I don't know if that's my favorite way to have the split of just fatiguing versus attacking,
sure,
but
yeah.
I think it does lead to very interesting spots. I think Bolton also has this going a lot. When you sit down against the Bolton, if you don't know whether they're on Sabres or Raiden, then it's hard to board correctly because the things that are good against Sabres aren't necessarily good against Raiden. You want like offensive disruption against Sabres, and you don't really want very many of the defensive cards. Like the defense reactions can really clunk up your hands against Sabres where you're like, they're like block with 3 cards, play my, what's the new card called? V for Valor. And then you're looking at your sink below it, and the next hand you draw a Fate Proceed, and you're like, oh no.
Yeah, for sure.
So
it's just a shame that overall, I think there are some cards that are just ubiquitously good against both those strategies. Things like that disrupt Arsenal a bunch. So Command and Conquer classically, obviously very good if they're trying to set up on these like core cards that help them have these pivot turns. Channel like Frigid or these disruptive effects. Frailty tokens are good against both versions. Like there are a lot of cards that do overlap between both strategies, but you're right, not every card does overlap between those 2 strategies.
Mm-hmm. And I do think that there are a decent amount of heroes that do things like that too. Like we talked about the curve with Icelander, or the like switching to physical attacks with Icelander, and now like Icelander is like every time you sit across from an Icelander, you're like, man, if this is all arcane Icelander, I would board differently than if I knew it was if I knew it was attack Icelander, and that's a pretty cool part of the game. It does mean that like if you don't have your pulse on the metagame, their finger on the pulse of the, I don't know what the phrase is. If you don't, it makes it kind of hard to do well in an event if you aren't kind of aware of what's going on or aren't following like the metagame, because like you have to sideboard without any information other than what hero your opponent's playing. So you do kind of need that knowledge of what different heroes are trying to do. It's not like we played Magic before, where Magic you get to play your game one. If you know what they were doing or don't know what they're doing, it might influence some of your plays you make during the game, but post sideboard you have a pretty good idea of what their deck looks like, and Flesh and Blood's very different from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then sometimes people will say things like, well, in top 8 they'll just know this thing and then my strategy loses so much equity, and I never care about that argument. If I'm on top 8, that's fine. Okay, I did it. I did the thing. Like, I'm already a very happy person, and I think them also knowing the information is worth some amount, but them actually understanding the play patterns is worth another like really decent like equity. And I think very classically, when you top 8'd your nationals event with Bullander, you played against an Oldheim and he presented like a bunch of armor into you, but he didn't understand that he should use all of the armor kind of aggressively, because you don't have any on hits. Just use the armor, get your value out of it when the attacks present themselves. I think he ended the game with like 2 or 3 block value in armor, like just face up. And I think when you're presenting novel strategies or different takes, even if your opponent knows the information, the Flesh and Blood is so complicated and like the play patterns can be so nuanced that it's still really challenging for your opponents to make the correct decisions when playing into it.
Yeah, I know. Another example of this is day 2 of Indianapolis this year. I played against Charles Dunn in the Swiss, and I knew he was on Fatigue Oldheim. I knew he was going to attempt to fatigue me. I knew he had Warhorn. I still played that game horribly. I learned a lot by playing him in Swiss, and it helped in the top 8. But I did basically know most of his deck before that point. So,
yeah. Okay. Any final thoughts about sideboarding though before we wrap things up, buddy?
I feel like we covered everything that I wanted to talk about. So I think.
Okay. Cool. Well, the next time that you're putting sideboard cards in your sideboard and you're sideboarding correctly for your sideboarded matchups, always remember, mind your manners. Thanks for watching.